Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. My name is Rebecca Spindler, and I'm the Executive Manager for Science and Conservation for Bush Heritage. I've been with Bush Heritage for just over 3 years now, and in case anyone was wondering, yes, I do have the best job in the world. I really appreciate you all taking the time and joining us for today's chat about the last season's fires, and particularly how Bush Heritage fared, how we're doing right now, and what we're doing in terms of preparing for the coming season. Today I recognise that I stand on what is, was, always will be Gadigal land, cared for tens of thousands of years by people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging of all the lands where we live and work, and recognise that as we stand on Australian soil, we stand on Aboriginal land. Thank you again for joining the conversation around the fires this last summer. We're very fortunate to have our National Fire Manager with us today, Richard Geddes, and after I give a short introduction, Richard will share with you some of his experience with the reserve staff through this last fire season and how we're preparing for the next season. I'll give you a little bit of a snapshot as to our future plans, and then we'll open up for questions. Sorry, just seeing that you can see a grey bar on my notes, which is not great. Just to do a bit of a run through for Zoom. If you are not familiar with Zoom, you'll probably see that there's a bar down the bottom. If you don't have a toolbar down the bottom, just move your cursor down towards the bottom of the screen, and you should be able to see that there is a number of different toolbars. It's not actually coming up for me either, so I will make sure we do that. So you have a mute button. We will ask everybody to go on mute during the presentation. Once we open up into questions towards the end of the session, please just come off mute and ask your questions. If you would like to wave at us either on your video or to let us know that you have a question, you should have an opportunity to put your hand up on that same toolbar. If you don't, or if you'd like to ask a question anytime throughout the presentation, just put your hand up. There's a little digital hand option that you have on your toolbar as well. If you'd like to write things into the chat session, which is, it's actually just called chat on my bar, or you might have a little speech bubble sitting on your toolbar that can give you the opportunity anytime throughout the presentation to just enter your question in there, and then we'll come back to you and ask that question later. As I said, we will ask everybody to go on mute. We'll be sharing our screens, both Richard and I, and then if you come off mute towards the end when we have questions, we would really love to hear you, to have your questions and have a conversation towards the end. Everyone's screen looks a little bit different. So, the other thing is that you will see that we have videos of everybody who's sharing their video at the moment. There's an opportunity on that separate little panel to reduce that entirely. So you can just look at one screen. So you can see the speaker who's talking at the moment on top of the slides, but you'll also be able to expand that out when we get to question times and see everybody, or you can have a completely minimized panel so you don't see anyone speaking. So feel free to have a play around with your Zoom screen and make sure that you're able to see our slides, but you're also able to set up as you need. All right, we might get going with the presentation. So I live in the centre of Sydney, and it was an absolutely scouring start to this fire season. There's absolutely no doubt. We had many, many weeks of breathing intense smoke, and the air was really filled with an absolutely hazardous fire, the result of the fires. This was just a constant reminder of what people were going through in the rest of New South Wales and Victoria, in these areas where we were experiencing serious mega blazes all the way through. I cannot imagine. My heart goes out to the people who have been through one of Australia's worst fire season on record, and are, to be honest, still seeing and experiencing many of those really painful experiences, particularly to those who lost people. My heart goes out to you, and I look for those experiences where we can work together. As I said, this is Australia's worst fire on record, with 12.6 million hectares burnt from incredibly diverse areas and diverse habitat types. Estimated 1 billion animals have been killed, and that doesn't include the second wave. So that doesn't include the number of animals that have died through predation. We know that cats in particular hunt on the fire scars of these mega blazes. And it also doesn't include species, individuals, animals that have died through starvation because there simply is no vegetation left. It's just absolutely untold. And of course, the human loss, not only of the people, but 2,800 homes lost. And one of the worst impacts is 400 megatons of carbon dioxide emitted, which of course will add to the impacts and the drivers of this climate change that leads to very dry conditions and leads to increased dry lightning strikes and more extreme events. So it's not only a terrible season, but it's going to add to some of the drivers that we see causes these extreme events. The photo that you have up here is of Matt Appleby and Brenda Duffy standing out on Burren Burren very soon after you've seen not only the fire, so you see the fire scars on the trees there, but you can see the impact of the floods as well. And thank goodness for those rains, those extreme storms that came through that really contributed to putting out the fires. But I have to say it did make our job a little bit harder as well, in terms of not only assessing the reserves, making it safe for staff, but going out and trying to start planning of how we should restore and regenerate. Of course, without those rains, we wouldn't be seeing the kind of regeneration that we have been across those reserves. So this is Burren Burren. This is one of the worst affected of our reserves. In this grand scheme of things, where we have such a scouring impact and extent of the fires this season, bush heritage has been relatively lucky. This is Burren Burren, as I mentioned, the worst affected. This was caught up in the Braidwood Channel fire that was generating its own weather systems and was really considered one of the mega blazes that was completely out of control. It would not have mattered what sort of preparation we'd done. Once you're caught up in those mega blazes, there is nothing you can do. And we are, in large extent, starting from scratch on Burren Burren, but it is lovely to see some of the regeneration coming through. We see economic growth. When we were out there, we heard a popplebonk frog. You know, there's certainly signs of life which are really encouraging. One of the other reserves that was significantly impacted is Scottsdale, which is just south of the ACT. And Scottsdale is one of our really lovely, it's an ex-farm, ex-productive farmland reserve. It's about 1,000 hectares. And you'll see over on the left-hand side is a photo I took about 6 months before the fires. And that photo up in the top right gives you an idea of the extent of the burning. Because Scottsdale was about 60% burnt, but it was patchy. It wasn't nearly as severe as the Burren Burren fire. And the most disappointing thing, I think, for us across Scottsdale, and not only was it incredibly stressful for our staff who live on site, and it was a very difficult time fighting that fire and being prepared to evacuate on a regular basis and deal with all the impacts of that, but knowing that we were losing some of our most important experimental plots for weed control across this area. A lot of the grassland of the Scottsdale Reserve has gone, and with that went our weed control experimental plots and many thousands of hours of volunteer time in regenerating, restoring, replanting much of the natural habitat of Scottsdale. But we are working hard to build that back again. So the other part of bush heritage being very lucky is the preparation work. The more you prepare, the luckier you are, and that's certainly true for bush heritage. So a lot of the reserves where we were not caught up in the mega blazes, we were extraordinarily lucky, and we were able to deal with a lot of those mitigating impacts through good, hard, honest work. And that's where Richard comes in. And Richard will now take over and tell you about the work that he's been undertaking with the reserve staff over really the last 9 months to make sure that we are actively prepared for and dealing with, as well as actively mitigating the risk of fires on our reserves, and making sure that we're protecting our partners and making sure they don't spread. So it's my great pleasure to hand over to Richard. Thank you, Richard.
Right, thanks, Beck, and hi everyone. And I'm sure a lot of people have seen a lot of things in the media and probably felt firsthand the impact of the Black Summer fires. So I'll touch a little bit on the more general side of those fires, but just like to sort of specifically talk about what's happened on bush heritage reserves. And it was quite a summer. It actually really started in August of 2019, and it only finished in March, the end of March, the fire season. So it was a huge fire season. I'm really happy to report that thanks to the supporters like yourself and other people, we've managed to spare a lot of the big impacts on bush heritage reserves, and less than 5% of our total reserves area. If you combined all the reserves of bush heritage into 100%, then about 5% was impacted. So a lot of that was really about the people in this photo here, and there's a number of different reserves there that I'll mention in a moment. I guess just personally, one of the things that happened for me was I'm sitting up here on Bundjalung country in the northern rivers of New South Wales, and the Black Summer for us really started in August, when the dry lightning storms, which ended up impacting most of the East Coast throughout the spring and summer, they started up here in August, and the fires started in up the back of the Tweed Valley where I live, and it's normally fairly wet forest, wet eucalypt forest with a lot of rainforests. We've got World Heritage rainforests on all the mountains around here, and after a couple of years of really severe drought, these normally wet areas actually started to burn, and it was a real concern. And we were actually choking on the smoke of those fires from about mid-August right through till the rains finally started to come through here in about December. The fires didn't go out, but at least we started to get some clear air, and that smoke obviously really started impacting further down in New South Wales. But in about September, with the bush heritage reserves really started to get impacted by fires, and the first dry lightning storm started to roll through our Queensland reserves and Yorka. If you look on this slide on the top right-hand corner, you've got, that's a picture from Yorka from the fires over the summer. You've got Paul Hales there pointing to a map, and the neighbouring pastoralists and other bush heritage workers all working in combination to stop these fires. It was really pleasing to report that that first fire in Yorka was contained to less than 1% of the reserve. And that was really due to not only the hard work in stopping that fire in September and all the firefighting that was involved in that, but the lead up, all the preparations that went into that, the talking to the neighbours, grading the fire breaks, doing the small planned burns in the winter time, where you can reduce the fuels, but you can also really enhance the biodiversity by protecting it from bushfires. So the planned burns, the firefighting, the working with all the neighbours really helped to stop that first fire at Yorka in September. Moving into October, we had dry lightning storms that sparked up in not only Carnarvon Reserve in central Queensland, but also Cravens Peak, which I'll touch on in a moment. And in the bottom left-hand corner there, you've got the staff from Carnarvon. And this was a really good example of where we were using the best of technology. We actually saw the dry lightning storm come through. We've got these websites where we can actually, in real time, in live time, we can watch the lightning strike. And we were watching on the internet the lightning strike. We sent a team out there, and we managed to contain that first fire to within about 40 hectares, which was a real testament to the preparation work that Carnarvon had done in securing our fire breaks and our planned burning, but then responding really quickly to put that fire out. Through November, the lightning continued, and it moved further south, this time in Yantabulla. And in the bottom in the centre there, you've got these two photos from Yantabulla Reserve next to Naree, which we manage. Yantabulla is a huge wetland that flooded last year, and actually only just recently flooded again. And this wetland, it floods often in autumn or in winter with the rains. And then by spring, late spring, early summer, it's all dried out, and it's a huge fire risk. And so the first lightning storm came through Yantabulla in late November. and they spent 3 weeks trying to contain that fire. And I'm really pleased to report that that fire was contained to less than 2,000 hectares and saved a really significant part of that swamp. Going further down on those photos, in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got Jeroen van Veen. Jeroen's a reserve manager from Victoria, and not only looks after the protecting those Victorian reserves from the risk of bushfire, but he also is a group captain in the country fire, the CFA in Victoria. And as part of that role, he led a strike team over a number of weeks on lots of different fires in New South Wales and protected a lot of those communities in some really catastrophic conditions. So not only do we work with our neighbours and rural fire agencies, but national parks and also pastoralists. There was a number of fires on Carnarvon, Yantabulla, Yorka, where our efforts actually saved a lot of the pasture and the livelihoods of our neighbours as well. So it's an important thing to remember is working together is how we're going to increasingly manage this threat in the future. The next slide, hopefully you can see, is it's just a rainfall map, and it's looking at the last 2 years leading up to December 2019 when the fires were peaking in New South Wales. And it just gives you an indication of how dry the country was. Not only the hottest temperatures on record of maximum mean temperatures in Australia were over 2 degrees, the average, so the hottest year, but also one of the driest. And those dark red areas were the lowest rainfall on record for that 2-year period. And you can see, particularly in New South Wales and parts of eastern Victoria, that's where the fires were at their most severe. One of the big drivers of this weather was not only climate change, but climate change is impacting the Indian Ocean. There's a phenomenon called the Indian Ocean dipole, which is essentially just the temperature of the Indian Ocean moving between Africa and northwestern Australia. In this case, the Indian Ocean was very cold off northwestern Australia. It was a negative Indian Ocean dipole, so the water was very cold. And what that actually did was block all the rainfall that normally moves across the continent from the west to the east. So the Indian Ocean really drove some of that very low rainfall, but it also combined with events in the Southern Ocean, which was driving these really strong westerly winds right through until December, January, which was driving a lot of the catastrophic fire conditions. The next slide is really just indicating some of the very extreme fire weather that we're experiencing. One of the common stories of the Black Summer was these incidents of pyrocumulonimbus. So essentially fires creating their own weather, as Beck was mentioning. And I'll show you another image of the South Coast in a moment, but these pyrocumulonimbus were just causing absolute havoc on the fire ground, creating their own lightning, so starting more fires, creating huge downbursts of wind, which was making the fire very difficult to control, and creating things like fire tornadoes, which is that picture on the right there, or fire whirls. The fire whirls actually were responsible for the fatality of a rural fire person near Albury in the summer, and so they're not only directly impacting the safety of people dealing with these fires, but making them very hard to control. And we've been experiencing fire whirls not only in New South Wales throughout this period, but also right into Queensland. I was at Yorka. We had a fire whirl that rounded our containment line and made it very difficult to contain that fire. And that's just one of these things that's getting more and more common, and it's believed that climate change is really driving this extreme fire behaviour. There's a lot of text on this next slide, but I just wanted to point out just a couple of things. The red areas are the areas of New South Wales that were burnt by these fires. There was also a lot of impact in Gippsland and in Queensland as well, but I'll just focus just for a moment just on New South Wales because it really did bear the brunt of some of these fires. One of the big things that, one of the biggest impacts I think on the biodiversity in particular was the 50% of the World Heritage rainforests in New South Wales and Queensland were impacted by these fires. And these rainforests are very fire sensitive. The eucalypt forests of southern New South Wales were also really severely impacted, and I'll show another slide in a moment. But there is more resilience in these eucalypt forests. There is more of a ability to bounce back. The the impact on the wet eucalypt forest and the rainforest were a real standout and a real concern for the future. As Beck mentioned, there was over 1 billion animals perished in these fires, and probably over 800 million just in New South Wales alone. Thousands of homes, and there's just an unprecedented summer, and I'm sure everyone's aware of what's been in the media about that. The next slide is just a really good example of the technology which is really helping to mitigate some of these threats. This is a map of the fires of New South Wales, but the different colours are actually the different severity or different intensity of the fires. And so you can see the red areas are the areas where the canopy of the forest was completely impacted by fire. So scorched like Burren, like the photos that Beck showed. But there was different degrees of severity. And you can see even in the Blue Mountains there and other areas, there was patches of green where the canopy wasn't actually impacted by fire in some areas. So it's really important to use these technologies to get a really good sense of the impact and where we need to focus our efforts for the future. And this type of technology is actually something that Bush Heritage is starting to use on their own reserves. And I'll show you that in a moment. Just to finish off on the New South Wales fires, this is a photo that was a satellite photo that was taken on New Year's Eve. New Year's Eve 2019. So this is when the South Coast New South Wales fires were at their worst. There was really heavy northwesterly winds driving these catastrophic fire conditions. You can see the really intense fires down in the bottom of that image. The scale of that photo is about 200 kilometres north-south. So it starts just south of Sydney, and the photo stretches right down towards Bega. And I'm really thankful to say that underneath that smoke cloud is Brogo Reserve, and Brogo Reserve remained unburnt. It narrowly missed a huge firestorm that devastated Cobargo and tragically claimed the lives of people there. But Brogo Reserve really now remains as a really important refuge and unburnt area in the sea of severely burnt Bega Valley and the surrounding area. So Brogo will be a really important area to maintain as a refuge. The next slide is actually relates to New Year's Eve as well. When the South Coast fires were raging on New Year's Eve, I got a call. I was just about to have a New Year's Eve champagne and got the call from a boss that the fire on Carnarvon Reserve, which had been started by a lightning strike on Christmas Eve of all time. So the staff at Carnarvon were fighting that fire from Christmas Eve through Christmas Day. And then by New Year's Eve, the fire really started to get out of control. So I got the call to go up and help. This image here is an image of part of Carnarvon, and the green areas are the areas that were burnt by planned burns in May and June and winter. These burns are very low intensity, and I'll show you a photo in a moment, but they were really key to stopping this fire. And I'm really glad to say that less than 1% of Carnarvon was burnt by this fire. We managed to contain it within about a week in early January. So it was a great testament to the work that the team had done up there. The purple stars on that image there are the fires that were active in the last 12 hours on New Year's Eve. So you can see how it actually spread south over the blue line. The blue line is Carnarvon Reserve boundary, and actually spread south into the neighbouring pastoral property. And we're really happy to go out and give them a hand, and we actually managed to contain it on their neighbouring pastoral property as well. So a great example of us working with our neighbours to stop that fire. This next slide that hopefully you can see, this is some of the work that's recently done the last couple of weeks. This is Chris, the reserve manager up at Carnarvon. He's done a small planned burn there. He's waited for the rain. We had really good rain in Carnarvon this year, and a couple of weeks after the rain finished, there's this perfect opportunity to do low intensity burns. We've got really good soil moisture after the rain. There's a lot of dew. We can light these fires in the late afternoon, and they can just trickle along and burn for a few hours, and then we can put them out with our crews and with the dew that falls overnight, and create a break that maybe might be 50 to 100 metres wide, but low intensity. The trees are they're not impacted at all. You can see the trees are really healthy, and it really helps us to have an anchor point. If there is a bushfire later on, we can use these planned burn areas to help stop that fire later on. This next slide that you hopefully can see, this is just an example of that satellite technology that we're using. The black fire scar that you can see in there, that's the fire that started from lightning in Craven's Peak in October. So really happy to say that this fire was contained with less than 1% of the reserve. It started in this biodiversity hotspot, the really long unburnt spinifex, where you've got mammals like the mulgara and threatened critical weight range mammals, all these threatened species in this really old unburnt habitat. So with the combination of acting really quickly, we managed to contain that fire on the shot line there, which is that green line, in combination with some of the small burns that we'd done in previous years. And we managed to contain that fire to a really small area and stop it spreading into the long unburnt habitat, which is one of our key conservation targets. The last couple of slides, I just wanted to just give an example of some of the work we're using, some of the work that we're doing with our partnerships. We've got lots of different partnerships in Northern Australia in particular with Aboriginal people, and one of the things that we can really do is bring the best of technology and our staff expertise and time, and work with the Aboriginal traditional owners to create some really good outcomes for protecting country, protecting healthy country forever. This photo here is a picture of Bunuba country. This is the Fitzroy River, and interestingly enough, the Fitzroy River is actually the largest river by volume in Australia. Obviously the Murray-Darling is the longest river and the biggest catchment area, but the Fitzroy River in the Kimberley is the largest volume of water rushes down there every wet season, and there's these huge flows of water which then gradually dry out. The Bunuba have recently been given native title back in the last few years, so this is a really good opportunity for Bunuba to start accessing their country, looking after their country through not only managing the risk of fire, but the risk of feral animals, getting some really good monitoring systems in place. We're helping a lot with monitoring of fauna through camera trapping and ecological surveys. And it's just such an amazing country. It's such a privilege to work with these people. The Bunuba have obviously been living there for thousands of years, and they've got an incredible cultural knowledge. And a couple of things are an example there. You can see that yellow flower on the bottom right-hand corner. The Bunuba people know that when that flower, it's called galini, when galini flowers on the banks of the Fitzroy River in the sand there, it's a small little shrub. When those yellow flowers appear, they know that the season of Girumbilli has actually started. So the season of Girumbilli is actually the perfect time to burn. It's a little bit like in Carnarvon, where you get the autumn rains, and then just after the rain you get really good soil moisture. It starts to dry out, and it's the perfect time to light little fires that will reduce some of the risk of bushfire and really serve the country well for when the bushfires start with the lightning later on. Another thing that we're really trying to protect there is some of the fire sensitive species. You've got the purple crown fairy wren there, which is on the banks of the Fitzroy River. There's also lots of other animals like the Gouldian finch, potentially threatened mammals like the quoll, that really rely on these areas being protected from fire to actually to maintain their populations. The next slide is really about right-way fire. So what is right-way fire? Well, right-way fire is just a term that's used right across Australia, particularly Northern Australia. And it's really about the right people for a start. You can see on the right-hand side of this slide, the Bunuba Rangers and traditional owners. These people need to be really involved in looking after their country. So talking to the elders, making sure that they're identifying all the fire sensitive areas, the cultural sites, the different clan estates. This country is actually divided up in all these different areas or clan estates. And so for each clan estate, you need the right people to have that cultural authority and to do the work on the ground. On the left-hand side there's a perfect example of Bunuba country where you've got rainforests. You can see all the palm trees there in the gorge. These rainforests are really fire sensitive. It's really important to try and protect those from bushfires. They're a real hotspot for bandicoots and quolls and critical weight range small mammals, which are really sensitive to fire. Also, they're a really important cultural site. Rainforests traditionally in Northern Australia have all the yams, and they're a really important food source, particularly in the wet season, not only for animals, but culturally for people. So you've got yams, you've got lots of different fruits, edible fruits for people, but also birds. So the rainforest's a real key area for us to try and protect. So it's not only about the right people, but it's also the right time. It's the season of Girranbarley when there's good soil moisture, there's cooler nights, there's dew. So if you do light fires, they're going to go out overnight and create a really good fire break around fire sensitive areas without much impact. The last slide I just wanted to point out, this is really sort of bringing all that right way fire knowledge together and using technology through the satellite technology. We've identified that area on the left-hand side there. It's an area that hasn't been burnt for many years. There's some really old spinifex in there. And as you may know, spinifex will actually keep on growing in most areas if it doesn't get burnt. And a good example of that is on our Pullen Reserve in Western Queensland, where the spinifex, they think, it needs to be unburnt for maybe 20, 30, 40 or 50 years. So it's big enough so that the night parrots have the habitat in that long unburnt spinifex. But also in the Kimberley here in Bunuba country, that old spinifex is critical to animals like the Gouldian finch. The Gouldian finch used to be in flocks of thousands right across northern Australia, but have had some really dramatic declines and been wiped out in many areas due to these large bushfires that have moved across the landscape and burnt all the spinifex. The reason that that's such a problem is that the spinifex is a critical source of seed, of food in the late dry season. And without that spinifex being able to seed and having no fire in that spinifex for at least 3 to 4 years, then the Gouldian finch is actually starved to death in the late dry season. So they're a little bit like the canary in the coal mine. We focus on some of these threatened species because they give us a really good indication of whether the country is being managed for fire properly. And what we're doing at the moment with Bunuba is trying to bring all that right way fire knowledge together, going to these long unburned areas, setting up camera traps, ecological surveys to monitor those populations and make sure that this country is protected into the future. And I think that's all I've got time for in the presentation. Thanks, Beck, and thanks, everyone.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Richard. I really appreciate that. And certainly not just coming on the call and working with us on doing this today and presenting this information, but for all the work that you've done with our partners to learn that right way fire, with our neighbours, and of course with all the fire agencies, RFS and everybody who've just been working over the last year to help protect this country. I've been talking to a number of our supporters, like those that are on the call today, and to thank them for their support, and they've returned that with thanks to you and to the teams out on the ground that have been fighting those fires. So if I can take this moment now to relay that thanks to you. Thank you very much for all the work that you do to keep us safe across the country. So that takes us to the challenges that we have just moving forward at the moment. In the age of COVID-19, obviously we do have the need to get out on country, and that's been hampered by having to socially distance, make sure that we keep our staff safe, make sure that we keep our Aboriginal partners and our other partners safe. But we are getting out there. It's an absolute priority to make sure that we are getting out on country, doing those mosaic burns, learning, implementing right way fire, as Richard has just explained and said that we're doing really across the country, and even more intensely. We know that we have to be focusing on improving our management of feral predators and invasive weeds, because they have the upper hand at the moment. Along these fire scars, we need to make sure that we're really controlling those invasive predators that have great advantage, where the native species have nowhere to hide and very little to eat, and making sure that those invasive weeds don't find open ground to investigate. And we're also working on many different levels to make sure that we are working with and understanding the dry and more extreme conditions as a result of climate change moving forward. I was actually talking to a leader of another environmental NGO the other day, and saying how hopeful I was actually in this post-fire and even COVID world, and they were a bit amazed. But it has been a really interesting experience to go through and see the impact of the fires, to see how much support there is in the community to try and do things differently, to really understand what are the underlying impacts of this, what are the drivers of these sorts of extreme change, and how do we work differently to mitigate it. And I think working with a number of different partners, particularly CSIRO, Bush Heritage has forged a really strong relationship with CSIRO, who's providing us enormous information, totally free of charge, lots of data about the likely impacts that we're going to see in terms of climate change. How dry is it going to get? How much hotter is it going to get across our landscapes? Building that understanding into our conservation planning is really manage, not just for today, but really managing the land for tomorrow. It's a very human instinct, I think, to look at the land and understand the environmental conditions you have now and managing the land to the best of your ability for right now. What we're able to do now is manage for 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future, making sure that we're building resilience as much as we possibly can, facilitating that adaptation, making sure that the landscapes are ready for the conditions we know we're going to see. Along with that, of course, is more extreme events. We know that Australia will generally be a little bit drier. There'll be some bit a little bit wetter. Everything will be hotter, and we know we'll have more extreme events. We will have more plagues, we will have more fires, we will have more floods. Making sure that Bush Heritage is 100% ready and able to deal with those sorts of events, as well as put in slightly more adventurous, proactive management regimes to make sure that we can get our habitats over the hump when we do have an extreme event. We're not interested in stopping adaptation. We know that these habitats need to adapt to the future, but in order to adapt, they need to survive these extreme events. So these are some of the things that we're working again with our traditional owners and Aboriginal partners really across the country, as well as academics and government, generating new ideas about how we manage natural landscapes to make sure that we can mitigate those really extreme events, as well as manage for the long-term resilience. So that's the end of, I did want to mention there's a lot more information from Richard and from our reserve staff, particularly around how we're dealing with the fires and preparing for the coming season in our bush tracks, which if you haven't received already, it should be coming into your email boxes and your newsletters, your mailboxes soon. And if you have any questions, please, again, don't hesitate to get in touch with us. That's the end of our presentation. I'll open up to questions. I will just remind you all that we're recording this, so we'd love to see your faces if you're happy to share. And we'd love to have your questions, but if you don't feel comfortable sharing your screen because we're recording, please just turn your little video icon off at the moment. Look at all these gorgeous faces. Hello, everybody, and thank you again so much for joining us. Please, at this moment, if you have a question, please just wave at me. You can put up your little digital hand or just unmute and you can tell me your question or you can type into the chat function, anything you'd like. Yes, Molly?
When can we visit to Scottsdale or Burren? When can we visit them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for that. And it's certainly, I know a lot of our volunteers are itching to get out on ground and actually start helping us do the work that we need to do. We're not in lockdown, but we're still in really strong social isolation. So we don't know is really the answer just yet. Molly, I'm sorry about that. We will keep you up to date. Certainly if you're in our email lists and if you're on our volunteer lists, we'll let you know as soon as you can visit. But we're still really very concerned about just keeping our staff safe in these areas and making sure that we're not bringing infection unnecessarily to these areas. So we will let you know, we'll keep you posted. Thank you. Did anybody else have a question? Yes, Jenny.
I was just wondering, how do we use planned burns now to protect the forest, especially down south of New South Wales, where so much land has been lost and the risk of some of these rare species being lost. So how do we manage planned burns in this new environment?
Richard, I'll hand that one over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Beck. I think the key is that every patch of country has to have a site-specific approach. So there's no one size fits all. It's really important to look at the history of the landscape, when the last time it was burnt, what sort of vegetation it is. And it's such a complicated thing that it really has to have so many different solutions coming together. I think I know the south coast of New South Wales quite well. It's obviously a really, there's a lot of debate about what the way forward is. And I think for a start, there's not one solution. It has to be, we have to bring everyone together to find the best solution. And that, in some cases, it might be planned burning. In some cases, that's not possible. There's a lot of areas that burnt in the south coast of New South Wales, like wet eucalypt forests and more sort of rainforest types, that there's no way you're ever going to do planned burning there. So it could be a combination of fire breaks, could be thinning vegetation, but also one of the key impacts, I think, is learning to live better in the bush, being a bit more prepared, having communities that aren't as such risk as they have been over the summer. So whether that's thinning vegetation, just working with your neighbours, and also I think one of the biggest things I think from this summer is that it is raising awareness. Despite all the huge catastrophic impacts, I think hopefully the community awareness from this event will actually help us find solutions in the future. It's probably a little bit indirect, the answer, but hopefully that sort of...
Yeah, well, that's true. Yep, thank you.
Thank you both. Thanks, Jenny. Thanks, Richard. We have a similar question actually in the chat box. So firstly, thanking you for a great presentation, but also asking a bit more about Tarcutta and regarding Indigenous fire management, gathering it's not so simple in the southern states, and how will you move forward with people such as the Yuin Nation to manage more complex southern landscapes?
Yeah, I think there's lots of principles with right way fire or Indigenous fire management that can be applied across the country. One of the things that is lacking in Southeast Australia is that detailed knowledge about specific sites. So there's lots of different sorts of vegetation, but the principles of right way fire, when you think about it, are things like we have to do fire shortly after rain when there's good soil moisture so that the canopy isn't impacted. Whether you're a national parks person or a forester or someone trying to protect a community, that principle can actually be applied in a lot of cases. The challenge that you have with that principle is that you have severely dry conditions. It may not be suitable to do any planned burning, but the principle to burn when there's good soil moisture and to try and not impact the canopy is a really important thing, and I think can be applied. Another principle is just to try and burn small areas when you do get opportunities. Burn small areas, because one thing that old people in Northern Australia and in the desert talk about is, you can burn a small area and maybe it's a waste of time, but that's okay because at least you haven't burnt too much. So burning small areas in small windows. One of the problems that land management agencies have is that when they do plan burns, they're often large areas. They have to work 9 to 5. They have to burn at a certain period and it might be too windy or too dry. So we really need to look at those windows and to make sure that, we might need to do burning at night time, for example, when the conditions are cooler. We need to resource those people so that the windows of opportunity are much bigger. I think just to go on and have a business as usual approach isn't going to provide many solutions. I mean, I probably could go on a bit there, but hopefully that discusses some of it.
I think that's perfect, Richard, and I think you may hopefully have answered Johannes' question in the chat, although we have another one. What would fires have been like before Indigenous people came to Australia, and whether we know anything about that?
Yeah, and I think, again, it's site specific. Australia is such a diverse country. I work with, the question talks about before white people came here, but I've actually, with our partnership areas, for example, I work with Otto Campion from Ramingining, and his people have never left the country. They've actually never left their clan estate. They've never actually stopped burning. So the knowledge has actually been passed on to generations, but in other areas, there hasn't been Aboriginal people there for many generations. So the knowledge has been lost. One of the things that's been really encouraging is that there's been an organisation called the Fire Sticks Alliance that some people may have heard of. Oliver Costello, Victor Stephenson. And what they're doing is they're going and finding where the old people still know some of the knowledge. And then if there's places where the knowledge has been lost, then they'll take those people down to another part of New South Wales or Queensland or whatever it is and start the principles of burning small areas, not impacting the canopy, and starting to bring that knowledge back. So it's a long road, and it's not always a solution, but I think we need to look at all the solutions, all the technology, all the people's experience. There's a lot of pastoralists that have been, you know, they stopped burning 50 years ago because they couldn't burn anymore. So there's a lot of knowledge that's out there that we can really tap into and combine that with the best in technology to manage those threats that will come in the future.
Fabulous. I might go back to the screens. Would anyone like to ask a question? Just wave your hand at me. Yes, Stephen. You might be on mute, Dal. We can't hear you.
I posted a rather long-winded question in the chat, but I'm really interested in how bush heritage is influencing the politics of landscape management more generally, given that the impact of those fires crossed all sorts of tenure boundaries, and there's all sorts of reactions from the public and from the instrumentalities that govern those policies. Is there any hope that there'll be a concerted national policy come out of this?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and obviously the Royal Commission into the bushfires that are going on at the moment is really drilling down onto some of that detail. The problem with Royal Commissions, as you may be aware, is that there's been a lot of Royal Commissions over the years, like the 2009 Black Saturday and previous, going right back to the 1930s, and a lot of these Royal Commissions have made similar findings. But I think, as you have alluded to, those findings or recommendations haven't always been taken up by our political leaders. So I guess it's yet to be seen whether they take up this last summer is actually going to cause some sort of change in political will, if you like. But I guess federally is one issue, but land management is really state-based and territory-based. So I think, you know, the decisions that the state leaders and territory leaders make are going to have just as much impact, probably a lot more than federally. I think federally, yes, there's a lot of issues there, like combining aerial resources, aerial firefighting resources and things, but the states really lead this land management discussion, and reducing the funding of rural fires and reducing the funding of national parks in certain state jurisdictions has really contributed to some of the lack of capability that happened in the last summer. So hopefully that is addressed. And I think there is encouraging signs. There's been some recent funding announcements by state governments that are hopefully a positive solution to some of that. But thanks for the question.
I recognise we're getting close to time, but I just wanted to add really quickly to that. I think Bush Heritage did put a submission into the Royal Commission. Our first point was, please see other Royal Commissions, because many of those recommendations have been ignored, and they've had, you know, spent a great deal of money on coming up with good recommendations, but then we've moved forward. I think the severity of these bushfires has also opened up much better collaboration across non-government and government agencies than we've ever seen before, and that would be part of my hope. You know, Bush Heritage's vision is a healthy country protected forever. I've been very focused and a little bit concerned about that forever over the last few months. But to see everybody working together across NGOs, across collaborative groups, has just been absolutely fantastic. Of course, you only have a right to hope if you're going to work your butts off to make it true. And that is absolutely what we're doing right now. I think we probably should acknowledge that we are out of time. Thank everybody for coming. Please, Kath, I note that there is a question in Takata there. Please don't hesitate to send those questions into us if you still have questions as a result of this. Read your bush tracks. If you still have questions, please get in touch. Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a joy to see your faces. Thank you all for your support. And we look forward to seeing you next time.